could.
Morning traders, time to place an order, and I'm going to place an order to buy euro. The price I'm looking to buy 119.30.2. Okay, so I'm going to place an order to buy at 119.30.2. So if you decide to follow this trade, if you want to follow trade or buy euro, it's time, and it's look like it will be filled any minute and will be in. Let's wait a little bit. If you don't know why we bought, why we placed an order, you can get a strategy that's on our website, or you can see the red line and the address, company.co.uk. You will get the strategy and you will understand how we trade. Position opened at 119.30.2. Okay, guys? All of you who managed to place an order and get filled, let's see and wait until we'll get a profit. Just to remind you, we don't place stop loss, so forget about it. We always make profit, we don't make losses, right? Okay, I'll speak to you later, guys.
In the past, of course, by Yellen, if we look at indicators such as unemployment and the unemployment amongst the lowest quartile of workers, Reynard pointed out a couple of weeks ago that that's at 23%. A lot of the jobs lost across the G10 have been in lower income jobs, leisure, tourism maybe, and hospitality. And of course, to again restate this argument, people who've lost their jobs on the lower income side, they're people with the highest propensity to consume. They tend to consume everything they have. The savings ratios that we've seen go up is generally because of higher income people who've kept their jobs, who save but don't consume everything they have. They've got a low propensity to consume. So from that point of view, it's still quite possible that we've got a long way to go still before we see demand returning to normal levels.
So you're not worried about inflation?
No, well, I suppose I'm on the economist side, the central bank side, and I'm really worried still, maybe a bit more like the likes of Yen and Brainard, about the unemployment rates that we do have. So I'm not concerned that the inflation that we're going to see is going to be highly, it's going to be there to stay around. I think most of the inflation that we will see, and we will see inflation, it will be caused because of base effects, because of the energy prices, food inflation, certainly. But that, again, is not the sort of inflation that central banks hike interest rates for. It's food price inflation is a sort of inflation that creates the same effect as a tax. It takes more money out of consumers' pockets and leaves them less money for everything else. So no, I'm still of the side that it is going to be largely transitory, and the central banks will really be trying to promote liquidity to help with the unemployment levels.
Jane, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the dollar maybe being more resilient than many people have given it credit for. With that and the higher yield story, how difficult is the picture for emerging market currencies right now?
Well, I think this is going to be really different to what we saw a couple of years ago. When we saw sort of dollar strength coming through in, 2018 or around about then, this is partly because we were having a big sell-off in emerging market currencies. And that, of course, was linked to the trade wars that we were having between the US and China. We've got a different administration now in the US, and the market isn't so worried about, these political tensions, although they are still there. And I think what we're going to have still is emerging markets still doing better this year on the growth story, the reflation story, etc., but perhaps not as much as the market had been expecting, because I think the dollar will be more resilient. So I think we will still have an outflow into high yield. I think the conditions about reflation are sufficient to prevail, for confidence to prevail, but perhaps not as much as the market had been expecting. So a little bit more dollar resilient, but not enough to see an outflow from EM back into the US.
Jane, on Friday we have the Bank of Japan. On Thursday we have the Bank of England. We're not expecting much from the Bank of England, but probably focusing on the longer-term risks to the economy and potential some of the bond buying. What does that mean for pound?
Well, there's a lot of good news in the pound, and that does worry me. And the Bank of England itself, it's quite surprising, really. If you go back perhaps to the early February Bank of England meeting, they were more optimistic than the market had thought. In fact, they've been pretty more optimistic than almost every other G7 central bank, and that's surprising given the context, given that there's also Brexit and that's having an effect on trade, for instance, and given also that the UK was the worst performing G7 nation last year. Its decline in GDP was down almost 10%. So from that point of view, perhaps it is surprising that we've seen this optimistic calls, particularly from Chief Economist Haldane, but to some extent also from Bailey, although he is a cautious optimist. By contrast, many of the other G10 central banks that have had better performing economies than the UK, such as maybe Sweden or Australia, have remained really quite cautious. So since February, I think that the bank has, the pound has really built up a lot of good news. The vaccine trade has certainly been something that's promoted it too. And I worry that the gains going forward will be a little bit more tough to achieve, because I think there is good news, a lot of good news in the price of the pound already.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Jane Foley, their head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Now, coming up shortly, Gernot Blumel, the Austrian finance minister. We'll talk a little bit about Euro level. We'll talk about trade. We'll talk about vaccines. That's coming up shortly. And this is Bloomberg.
Surveillance. Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Extraordinary market day.
This rally just keeps on going.
But there is a tipping point.
The business team you love to watch. Weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacroix in London and Kaylee Lines in New York. Let's get to the first word news, our top stories from the Bloomberg terminal. There hasn't been a major federal tax hike since 1993 in the United States. Bloomberg has learned that President Biden wants to change that. He'll call for higher taxes to pay for a long-term economic recovery program. That plan would include initiatives on infrastructure, climate, and expanded help for poorer Americans. The president would like to repeal or try and repeal portions of Donald Trump's tax law that benefited corporations and wealthy individuals. In China, economic activity soared in the first 2 months of the year compared with a year ago, but the figures show an uneven recovery. China posted strong industrial output fueled by exports, but consumer spending is lagging. There were growth rates of more than 30% in some sectors, largely due to distortions caused by last year's shutdowns. And more problems for AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine. The Netherlands has joined a list of about a dozen places moving to suspend the shot over concerns over possible side effects. Regulators from Europe to Asia said there's no indication of any direct link between the vaccine and reports of serious blood clotting after inoculation. Nonetheless, European countries have suspended its use. And here in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel is feeling the wrath of voters. Her Christian Democratic Union crashed to its worst results since the Second World War in 2 regional elections. Voters vented their frustration over the government's handling of the pandemic, prolonged lockdowns, and the slow pace of vaccinations. So the interesting thing here is, no surprise that voters are angry that we're still on a pretty draconian lockdown here in Germany. The interesting thing is that the Greens continue to gain power, especially in those states, Rhineland-Palatinate and Baden-Württemberg.
Yeah, of course, you have domestic elections in September. That will be a huge challenge for the new CDU leader, Matt, to try and figure out exactly the path forward for him. The other thing that I noted is actually, if you look at the far-right Alternative for Germany, they suffered the worst losses in support in both states. So that's something that the market will also sit up and take notice of.
Yeah, and Francine, you talk about those elections, the national elections coming in September. There's also the question of who is going to lead the CDU party, because it's not going to be Angela Merkel. So who is going to be the leader going into those elections within that party obviously remains an open question, Francine.
Yeah, so we'll have, a lot of things actually that we need to look at, of course, for the CDU and the path forward. Now, coming up next, Gernot Blumel, the Austrian finance minister, will ask him, of course, about maybe their German neighbors, some of the political losses or wins because of how they handled COVID-19. Of course, we'll talk about vaccines and AstraZeneca. This is Bloomberg.
Everybody says we should practice before we go to Mars, but some people say we need to practice on the moon. Well, you could practice on the moon, but you can do it at 1/10,000th the cost in the desert in Utah.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Monday, a Bloomberg exclusive conversation. Bank of America Chairman and CEO Brian Moynihan, live at 12:30 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kaylee Lyons in New York. We only have 4-hour difference for the next 2 weeks between London and New York. Matt, quite a lot going on in the markets, quite a lot going on in terms of vaccine and everything like that. Kaylee, that's also filtering through a big week for central banks and treasuries.
It is a huge week for central banks, especially all eyes will be on the Fed on Wednesday, though we also get the BOE, the BOJ, and several emerging market central banks as well. Ahead of that, on this Monday morning, we are seeing futures in the green, and the gains are building as the session grows older, but the rotation trade is still entirely intact. At least indications will be that it will be in about 4 hours' time come the opening bell. Russell 2000, those cyclically oriented small caps, those futures up 0.6% relative to a gain of just about 0.3 for the NASDAQ 100. Of course, that index not being weighed on today by higher bond yields. They come in by about a basis point. Still, though, we are sitting at 1.61% on the 10-year yield. That is the highest in about a year. So some of those high growth names still will be contending with that dynamic. Of course, with higher yields has come a stronger dollar, but the stronger dollar is waning a bit today. The dollar spot index now basically flat, sitting the dollar index at 91.72 at this point. As for some movers in the pre-market, what you should watch come the opening bell, NXP Semiconductors and Penn National Gaming, each up more than 6% after news on Friday. They will be included in the S&P 500. That inclusion is official as of March 22nd, so a week from today, but still big gains for those names before the bell on that news. And then two other stocks I would point to, AMC Entertainment and GameStop, each higher by 6.6 and 5.8% respectively. That is on the idea that all that stimulus money that's about to hit Americans' bank accounts, Matt, is going to partially go into these names.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Americans do with those stimulus checks. Wednesday, they go out. Hopefully, your bank gets yours to you quickly. I'm looking at GDP forecasts, but what I'm really thinking about is...
Okay, traders, we need to place stop on profit. And I'm going to place stop on profit for euro at 119.32.2. Just right here. Okay, so if you do start it, follow my trade. So you need to place stop on profit. And let's see what's going to happen next. Anyway, whatever happened, you will not end up in loss, right? So please do so. And let's see if it will move higher. We will change, we'll move up our stop on profit too.
Europe, because it just looks like the EU has done such, well, a much slower job in getting the vaccine doses that are necessary, Francine.
Yeah, and then of course there's everything going on with AstraZeneca and a number of countries in Europe just deciding not to vaccinate with that vaccine. Now let's get more on the European vaccine row. And Austria has accused bureaucrats at the European Union of running an opaque system for allocating supplies of the COVID vaccine. Now the nation's Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, says secret deals with pharmaceutical companies are undermining the policy of inoculating the EU's population equally across countries. Austria and other EU nations lag way behind the US and the UK, as Matt was saying, in the rollout of the vaccine program. Well, joining us now is the Austrian Finance Minister, Gernot Blümel. Minister, thank you for joining us. How quickly can you accelerate the inoculations to make sure that growth doesn't suffer too much?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Well, we all have to try to improve the speed of vaccination. I think we have to admit that on the European level, not all things have been perfect when negotiating the contracts with pharmaceutical companies. But also on national levels, there's still room for improvement. In Austria, we are speeding up the vaccination program. More and more people are getting their jabs. And this will definitely contribute to a better growth in 2021. And I hope that we will have overcome the pandemic by summer. That would be the most important thing for the economy.
Minister, I know that over in the fall you actually put a cap on how much could be spent on these vaccines. Have you now removed that cap, and are you willing to spend whatever it takes to make sure that people are vaccinated to have the right access to the vaccines?
Well, that's simply not true. We have no cap on vaccination costs. Already last year we have
never had it.
Budgeted more. We never had a cap. It was always said that as much money there is necessary for purchasing vaccination, this money will be supplied. This year, just for this year, 120 million have been in the budget of the Minister for Health, 120 million euros, and until now only 30 million euros have been called. And if there is more need for money to buy more doses, then there will be more money. We have a pot where we can supply money for COVID-related.
Okay, position closed at 119.32.2. As you can see. Well done, guys. You made your profit. And let's move on to another pairs. Let's find what other pairs will be profitable for us. If you got the strategy you can use on different pairs, we have many screens, so I cannot show you all the screens. But if you use our strategy, you can look for other pairs. This is how you day trade based on a relatively small amount of profit. Over the day, during the day, you will make quite large amount of profit. And over the years, it will be enough for you to basically survive, yes, to make enough money. Okay, guys, well done. Good. Stay safe, and I'll speak to you later.
The general approach is to be appreciated.
Why doesn't Europe spend more money now in order to dig itself out of this hole, Mr. Minister? I mean, have you submitted a draft EU recovery fund plan to the EC?
The draft recovery plan will be submitted by April. We are already in negotiations with the Commission, which projects can be implemented within this recovery plan. But this has nothing to do with the vaccination program. If you refer to the vaccination program, we are totally willing to spend more money on that, because
Mr. Minister, can I just ask, so many people have lost jobs, so many people are unemployed across Europe, the big dip in demand is palpable. Why wait until April? I mean, shouldn't it have been done last April?
Well, first of all, the money from the recovery fund isn't flowing until the end of the year, I would guess. What we are doing on a national level is spending much more, much faster. Austria has the biggest fiscal spending program in all over European Union. We just had our Standard & Poor's rating with a AA+ stable outlook, where we were confirmed to have reacted swiftly and accordingly to the crisis. and we are spending a lot of money for short-term working scheme much earlier than other countries in Europe did, and we're spending much more in helping companies by direct payments to get through this crisis, because we know that as soon as the crisis is over, our economy will boost back, and therefore we want to have a healthy